There is a moment inside every great institution when the people running it quietly admit that something has broken. It does not always happen in a press conference or a dramatic announcement. Sometimes it happens behind closed doors, in a room where the cameras are not rolling and the microphones are not on, and the only witnesses are the walls. That moment, according to royal insiders, has arrived inside Buckingham Palace. And the ripple effects of it are now being felt by every member of the British royal family. The story begins not with a single explosion, but with a slow accumulation of pressure. King Charles III, who spent decades waiting for the crown and finally received it in the shadow of grief and cancer and scandal, has reportedly made a decision that would have been unthinkable even 2 years ago. He has begun transferring final decision-making authority to his son, Prince William, not just delegating tasks, not just asking for help, but actually stepping back from the hard calls that define what it means to be the sovereign. And at the center of the storm swirling around this shift stands Queen Camilla, a woman who fought for decades to stand beside the throne and is now reportedly watching her power slip away in real time. To understand how we arrived here, it is important to go back and look at what 2025 and early 2026 actually brought to the House of Windsor. It was not a quiet period. The year began with King Charles still battling his undisclosed form of cancer, a diagnosis that shook the palace to its foundation even as official statements tried to project calm. Charles had not slowed down in the way many expected. He continued appearing at engagements, continued carrying out the public duties of the crown, and continued trying to project the image of a monarch very much in control. But inside the palace, a different picture was forming. The crisis that finally forced everything into the open came in the shape of Prince Andrew. Virginia Giuffer's posthumous memoir hit the public like a tidal wave, and shortly after, explosive emails surfaced through the U.S. Department of Justice's release of new Jeffrey Epstein documents. Those emails allegedly showed that Andrew, while serving as the UK's trade envoy between 2010 and 2011, passed sensitive and classified government information to Epstein. In February 2026, Andrew was arrested. The man who had once been a senior royal, a son of Queen Elizabeth II, a decorated naval officer, was now in custody and facing charges that reached far beyond anything the palace had previously navigated. It was the kind of scandal that does not just embarrass a family, it threatens the very legitimacy of the institution they represent. AOL. William moved fast. According to people familiar with the internal dynamics of the palace, the Prince of Wales made his position absolutely clear to his father. The monarchy could not afford to be seen protecting or standing beside someone who had already done irreparable damage to the family's reputation. This was not just about Andrew. This was about survival. William had successfully convinced his father that the firm could not take another hit to its reputation by supporting those who had already damaged it. The message was firm and it was direct. Cut the ties, act decisively, or watch the institution bleed credibility it did not have left to spare. The news. Charles listened. Andrew was stripped of his remaining royal titles and honors. He was told to prepare to vacate Royal Lodge. The palace moved with unusual speed, and observers inside the institution noticed something important. The voice driving those decisions most forcefully was not the king's. It was William's. That shift in gravitational pull did not go unnoticed by Camilla. According to royal insiders, she was fuming over the way William and Kate had pushed her aside and bulldozed their way into controlling the palace's response to the Andrew fallout. She had watched the two of them move through the crisis with a confidence and authority that felt, to her, like a direct challenge to Charles's reign, and by extension, to her own place within it. One source described her quiet rage as something that had been building for months, not weeks. Another said she had told people close to her that watching power drain away from her husband felt like a personal devastation, because she had waited just as long as Charles had for the chance to sit beside the throne. Camilla is just trying to hold on to the throne for as long as possible, one insider said, and taking it away is devastating her. Geo News. For Camilla, this was never an abstract political dispute. It was deeply personal. She had spent years being compared unfavorably to Princess Diana, years fighting for public acceptance, years being dismissed or reduced to a footnote in someone else's story. When Charles finally became king, it was supposed to be her moment too. Queen consort. Then, in a significant elevation, simply queen. The woman who had waited in the wings for so long finally had a title that matched her reality. And now, from her perspective, a younger generation was quietly pushing her aside while pulling Charles along with them. The tension between Camilla and William had been building long before the Andrew crisis brought it to a head. Reports from early 2026 described what insiders called open warfare inside the royal family, with palace aides saying the rift between the Princess of Wales and Queen Camilla had become almost impossible to contain. One particularly revealing incident emerged around the state visit of Donald Trump and Melania Trump to Britain. Camilla allegedly shooed Kate away during a private conversation with Melania, a moment that, though disputed by some, fueled talk of a growing rift that had been simmering for months. Kate did not forget it. William certainly did not. ALAL. Then came June 2026, and a wedding in Gloucestershire that became a flashpoint for everything that had been simmering beneath the surface. Peter Phillips, the son of Princess Anne and one of William's closest cousins, married NHS nurse Harriet Spurling at All Saints Church in Kemble. It was supposed to be a joyful family occasion, attended by nearly every senior royal. What happened behind the scenes told a very different story. Reports emerged that a disagreement had erupted between Prince William and Queen Camilla over access to a tiara from the royal collection for the bride. The claims pointed to growing friction behind palace doors at a time when senior royals were supposedly preparing for a major family celebration. International Business Times. According to insiders, the row was intense enough to become a heated talking point in the run-up to the ceremony. In the end, Harriet sidestepped the entire dispute, choosing a tiara from the Pragnell family, the jewelers who made her engagement ring, rather than borrowing from the royal collection at all. One source said her decision speaks more about her diplomacy than William or Camilla winning and getting their own way. It was a graceful move that diffused the public optics of the situation, but the damage between William and Camilla had already been done. International Business Times. Even after the wedding was over and the photographs were published and the public saw only smiling faces, Camilla was still angry. Even though it's a moot point now, one insider said, Camilla is still mad. She went to Charles and reportedly urged him to put his son in his place, to make clear that William was overstepping, that the crown still sat on Charles's head, and that decisions of this kind were not William's to make. According to reports, Camilla urged King Charles to take down a peg his arrogant son. Stylecaster International Business Times. The most striking allegation to emerge from this period was that Camilla had privately accused William of treating Charles's reign as merely a formality before his own eventual accession. It was a cutting accusation, and it landed with weight inside a palace that was already navigating an unusually complicated moment. Charles was a king who loved his son, respected his judgment, and relied on his capabilities, but who also loved his wife and understood the sacrifice she had made and continued to make in standing beside him through everything. BTS Times. Charles faced a choice that no father and no king would want to face. On one side was Camilla, a woman he had loved for decades, fought to legitimize, and elevated to the highest position a woman could hold in the British monarchy. On the other side was William, a son who had shown, repeatedly and under pressure, that his instincts about the monarchy's survival were sound. Threading through both of those relationships was the reality of Charles's own health. William was reportedly concerned about how much his father was doing while undergoing cancer treatment, feeling that Charles had not stepped back in the way he should. And the more Charles pushed himself, the more the question of who was really making the hard calls became impossible to ignore. Reality T. Charles's response was not dramatic. There was no announcement, no press conference, no formal ceremony of transfer. What happened was quieter and in many ways more significant. Charles began formalizing what had already been happening informally for months. He gave William a clearer, more authoritative role in the decisions that actually mattered, not the ribbon-cutting and the ceremonial moments, but the choices that shaped the monarchy's reputation, its relationships, and its future. He acknowledged, in the way that kings acknowledge things when they do not want to say them out loud, that the voice most likely to steer the institution through its current turbulence was the one that belonged to the next generation. Royal observers noted that the palace's handling of the Andrew scandal had been widely interpreted as a firm shift under King Charles's leadership, but the fingerprints most clearly visible on that response belonged to William. He was the one who had drawn the line. He was the one who had refused to let sentiment cloud judgment. He was the one who understood that in the court of public opinion, the monarchy's greatest asset was its credibility, and its greatest threat was the willingness to protect people who had forfeited theirs. The news. For William, the moment represented a validation that carried its own complicated weight. He had pushed for this, in his own way, not out of ambition for its own sake, but out of a genuine and urgent belief that the institution he would one day lead could not afford any more self-inflicted wounds. His emerging strategy made clear that he believed the monarchy's survival depended on cutting ties with scandal-hit royals, and that he had plans to address even his younger brother Harry in time. The message he was sending, consistently and without apology, was that the era of managing crises after the fact was over. The new approach was prevention, accountability, and if that made him unpopular at the dinner table, so be it. The news. Kate, throughout all of this, stood firmly alongside her husband. There were reports that the tensions with Camilla had worn her down, that the accumulation of slights and frictions and the emotional toll of the Andrew crisis had been significant. One insider said the York saga had been exhausting on every level and had worn down the entire family, not least Kate, who had stood firmly alongside William throughout it all. But she remained steady. She appeared where she was needed, supported William at the moments that counted, and managed to project a kind of composed dignity that made her, in the eyes of many watching from the outside, the most stabilizing presence in an increasingly unstable house. AOL. Camilla, for her part, was not finished. She was not a woman who accepted defeat quietly, and those who knew her well said she would continue to push back against the direction things were heading for as long as she had any leverage to push with. But the balance had shifted in ways that were difficult to reverse. The palace's advisors, its senior aides, the people who shaped the daily reality of royal decision-making, they had made their own quiet assessments, and increasingly the answers they were working toward did not lead to Camilla's door. The British public, watching from the outside, could see only glimpses of the full picture. They saw the official engagements and the carefully managed photographs and the press statements designed to project unity. What they could not see were the corridors and the arguments and the moments of reckoning that defined what the palace was actually going through. But those with a clearer view of the institution were drawing a conclusion that felt increasingly unavoidable. King Charles, a man who spent his entire life preparing to be king, had decided that the most important thing he could now do for the crown he had waited so long to wear was to begin the careful, deliberate process of passing the real weight of it on. Not yet, not formally, not with ceremony or announcement, but in the way that actually mattered, in the decisions that shaped the monarchy's future, in the trust placed in the next generation's hands, in the quiet and irreversible acknowledgement that the man most prepared to carry the institution forward was not the one who had worn the crown the longest. It was the son who had always been next. And now, for the first time in a very long time, the palace was beginning to act like it.